Chris and everyone. Welcome back to the We Are Lock podcast.
Oh, wait a minute. I thought we retired that podcast.
Yes, you are right. And actually, maybe this episode should be Welcome back to the We Are podcast. But to be fair, we did agree with Lavinia that given that we already had a guest booked, that we would go ahead with this final episode of the We Are Lock podcast.
Yay. But sadly, without Lavinia.
Yes, without Lavinia. And we do miss her. We miss you, Lavinia. Hopefully she'll listen.
We do.
Yeah. So, I mean, the reason that we wanted to circle back to this particular podcast, because hopefully all of you know that Chris and I have another podcast, Morning Tinto. But the reason we wanted to come back to this is because the theme was around professional sustainability. And given that one of the episodes that we did was where I talked specifically about higher education, sustainable development within universities, we thought we would invite someone from within this higher education landscape to hear what the current state of play is. Now, this was like pre-November and, things have changed and we really want to know how folks are doing. How's their mental health? How's their well-being? And so I would like to welcome Julianna to the podcast.
Welcome, Julianna. Would you like to introduce yourself to us and our listeners?
Yes, thank you both so much. And I appreciate you still wanting to bring me on after your shifting gears, but I'm really happy to be here and to talk about some important things happening in the moment, but also sort of the kind of work that I've been engaged in recently that I think is quite relevant and perhaps more important than ever at this point in time. So to introduce myself, my name's Julianna Gwiszcz, and I stand for justice, integrity, authenticity, compassion, healing, and regeneration for people and planet. And I start there because my work, my entire career, and my life on a personal level is very much driven by these core values and foundations. And I think it's important, especially those who have any chance of a public voice or who are shaping thought or involved in education in any form, to really be transparent about those values and to really keep those as an anchor point and a compass for the work that we're doing. And so I've had a lot of different roles throughout my career. Among the many ever-changing hats I've worn have really included things like transformations catalyst, capacity builder, connector, social worker, healer, applied anthropologist, a transdisciplinary scientist, educator, scholar-practivist, which is me combining practitioner and activist. And I really feel like those are core parts of my career and identity, and the list goes on. And I've really crossed sectors, working as a strategist, an educator, a network builder, an engagement steward, designer, program manager, storyteller, and a global edupreneur and entrepreneur, because I really feel that education is so critical to the work in climate action and sustainability and sustainable development worldwide. And that obviously there's things that need to change and evolve and adapt to the changing climate that we're trying to work within and address. And I devoted really 15 plus years to catalyzing transformations and really weaving unlikely connections across divides. And I'll just end by saying that my work has been very untraditional to what you would typically find in academia, and that's been intentionally so. I really feel so passionate about this work, and to be able to do it with and in partnership and through higher education has been quite a privilege and an honor for me, but it's also come with a lot of challenges, especially because of working within systems that have been around and substantiated for, decades, generations. And I think that now more than ever, we really need to be thinking about the role of higher education in how it's showing up in society and how it's responding to these really global challenges. And that's a core part of the work that I've been doing, and intersecting across education, the climate action and sustainable development space, but also global health and human rights, systems change, healing art and design, and impact philanthropy. And I think all of these pieces really come together nicely in the kind of things that you guys been talking about in your own podcast. So thank you again for welcoming me today.
Well, thank you, Juliana. I'd be interested to hear, given particularly that you highlighted your approach as somewhat non-traditional in the world of academia, would you be willing to talk a little bit about how your well-being is and how is that similar to and perhaps also different from the well-being of colleagues and other people close to you right now? So it could be whatever level you wish to talk about in terms of yourself, as well as those you're connected to, maybe faculty and staff, perhaps students and communities by extension. And I also want to point out, particularly for our listener base, which is international, I'm based in the United States, born and raised. You are also based in the United States. Heather is in the country of Colombia, but is from the United States. Now, all of us have had various experiences with higher education, either as students or teachers. So we each bring our little flavor of experiences to this conversation. Just provide that for context for our listeners. So I'll go back to my question with that. Tell me a little bit about, for whatever level you want to share, your well-being and the well-being of those close to you at this time.
Thanks for that, Chris. Yeah, I mean, to put it bluntly, it's a difficult time, and there's been a lot of anxiety, fear, uncertainty, a lot of questioning what's going to happen. How is this going to shape not just the work that I'm engaged in, my colleagues and dear friends who are working across these different landscapes I mentioned earlier are engaged in, but also on a very personal level, how it's shaping the lives and families and communities of those doing this work and the communities that they're serving, really. Because none of us that are engaged in climate action work or educators or working towards sustainable development, we're in this because we're passionate about it. We're in this because we have a deep, deep sense of commitment and values that are driving us forward, that we want to see healing, we want to see resilience and action that's actual well-being of people and planet. And what we're seeing is, or I should speak for myself, what I'm seeing and what I'm feeling is very much a direct attack on that, what's happening right now. And that is a hard pill to swallow, but it's not something I haven't seen before in a sense. And I'm reflecting on this not from, we're in a very, the word unprecedented is thrown around a lot these days, but we are in a very unprecedented moment in certain regards. But the attack on climate change work and the attack on the kind of justice values and the justice work that I've been engaged in has a long history, and it's not, specific just to the US, obviously. In fact, this is perhaps quite a rehashing of things that have been witnessed around the world in a lot of different ways. It's been compared to, obviously, what other countries and communities and cultures have gone through across generations. And it's not something that perhaps we've taken for granted in the US, in terms of the stability, or the sense of, at least, the perceived stability of that freedom and that the kind of equal opportunity to do this kind of work. And it's not necessarily shown up in our lives in such a direct and transparent way as we're seeing right now. And the way that it's hitting not just myself and my colleagues and my, family and friends all around, not just the States, but also around the world, because a lot of my work has very much been international and has, crossed boundaries and borders, and intentionally so has tried to unite us and to bring us together in this collective effort. Because in order to address things like climate change, we need that collective effort. We need that connection and community. And right now, what I'm sensing is that the intention is really to drive that apart, drive that collectivity and that ability to work in tandem and to really stay strong and find our anchor points more difficult, and to create confusion and mayhem and chaos. And that's an unsettling place to be in. But again, in working in a space like climate change, there's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, that's the name of the game, right? And that's something that has been from the very beginning, there's been a lot of having to fight against those who are denying it, and to speak up and speak out when you're being attacked for your science. And that's not something unfamiliar to a lot of the colleagues I've worked with and what I've been exposed to even on my own level. And to a different degree, I would say that it's taking a really heavy mental toll on us, but it's also taking a toll in terms of being physically draining, and just zapping a lot of that energy of what we're really supposed to be focusing on, distracting us from the really important matters at hand, the kind of work that we're trying to do, or bringing it to a halt. And that creates a lot of concern and fear around, well, what do we do now? Will we have the ability to move this forward, or all the work that we've poured into this over the years, is that just going to be wiped out? And a lot of people are seeing that happening right in front of them, especially those who are working in spaces that are either directly or indirectly tied to the government at this point. So it's definitely a real fear that's very much valid and something I'm sensing across the board. But I'll also say that in, like, particularly from the educational setting in higher education, there's a lot of, like, everybody wondering, how are we going to react? How are we going to respond? Things are happening so rapidly that it's almost like we can't necessarily find a moment to really get our bearings before the next big hit happens. And so what is it that we're going to be? Are we united in the same path forward is a question that I keep coming back to. And what is that path? What is it that we're trying to get to, or get back to, in a sense? Does that make sense at all? I'm kind of talking more broadly right now because it's touching on so many different sectors. And education is connected, which many people don't necessarily realize, connected so deeply to a lot of different sectors, again, intentionally so, to be able to do the really important work, whether it's through research or education, or it's through lifting up policy and advocating for different justice issues or rights. And I mean, there's so many different interweavings that you can't completely disentangle it. And I think that that's something that is becoming more and more apparent to the general public right now than it has been perhaps ever or in a long time.
Yeah, there's a lot there, and it sounds, and I am removed from it being in South America. It sounds, yeah, really, like you say, draining. And I'm wondering, so how have you started doing things like throughout your day and maybe with colleagues that keeps you kind of grounded and anchored, like you said? Like, are you finding practices? Are people meeting specifically around this? How do you collect people who might be feeling isolated? Yeah, I'd like to hear about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit it on the head right there. The strategy that I'm using and that I'm hoping will support others is connecting, creating those different pathways for connection right now more than ever. But that's always been something that's been critical to the kind of work that I do, especially around engagement. But I feel that leaning into community is the only way forward right now, or one of the most important way forwards, I should say. And it's something that has been a lifeline for me in particular, but also seeking out sources of hope, because there's a lot of, like I was saying earlier, with the chaos, with the being hit from every angle, there's a lot of negativity. There's a lot of overwhelm. There's a lot of, like, being put on the defense, and that creates a reaction out of fear, and that makes fear in the driving seat. And what I'm seeking more than ever, because I know that's written into my DNA. That's how I respond, and so striving as hard as I can to really not just avoid that. It's not that at all. It's actually acknowledging that, to be able to call it what it is, and to then try to seek out sources of hope that will be a counter to that fear being the driver. And it's not easy, to be honest, right now. It's been really difficult. I find myself on a roller coaster of emotions on the daily, no doubt. And I just keep reaching out to my colleagues, to my friends, to partners that I've had in terms of organizations, like leaders of organizations and institutions, some that are directly in higher education, some that work and partner with higher education around the world. Because again, the other thing is that we get lost in our own viewpoints or our tunnel vision of the particular things that we're seeing, and social media is a core contributor to this. Obviously, the news is contributor to this, but it's really important to push past those blinders and to be able, and not that they're necessarily leading us in bad paths or giving us false information. What I'm actually talking about is how do we see other perspectives and enable us to really understand how everyone's coming to the moment, because no one's being untouched by this. Even people that may be denying that this is a real challenge or a real crisis, they're still being impacted, whether they recognize it yet or not. And so bearing witness to what's happening, and making it clear how we're interpreting, understanding what's happening, is, I think, a really important aspect of what we can do to feel like we have some agency still, which is, I think, the other big piece of this is trying to cling to what agency I do have, what capacity I do have, reminding myself of that, even though some days it feels like it's all being stripped away or none of it matters. And I know a lot of people, my colleagues especially, are sensing this and are feeling like they can't do anything and are helpless. And I think that's exactly what's desired out of the moment. And how do we really push back against that and reclaim that power, reclaim that capacity, and agency, I think is something that's, even if I'm not doing it very successfully at every moment or feeling like I'm, like it's making much of a difference, it is mentally and internally in terms of my own well-being in a way. And I think that shouldn't be completely ignored either. That's an important aspect of how we can really show up in the moment. So,
yeah, I mean, you're talking about like nervous system dysregulation, aren't you? And we do need community to co-regulate. And you mentioned like calling up someone or, doing that. And are there times where it's people coming together, like more in a collective way, meeting up, or is it more one-to-one?
It's both. It's all things, especially right now, trying to find all the different avenues of community. And I think it's also been difficult because this is happening, on the backs of, or the back of, a global pandemic where isolation is at an all-time high, right? And it's something that has been almost seen as a source of resistance in its own way to that isolation, but also in this moment to see how we can come together. Some groups are organizing in direct action types of approaches, but there's also just being in community that I think is that source of hope and that re-energizing aspect that is so critical right now. And sometimes it's directly related to what's happening and how to process it and really reflect on how we can be of service in this time. But also other points, it's how do we pull completely away, like taking that time that I'm with my family to be with my family and not let my horror of what's happening essentially drive that. And I've actually had to really be pulled back from that from, my own siblings at points, because I can't tune it out, especially when so much of it is having a direct impact on the lives of people and the things I care about so deeply. But the other aspect is like finding moments to, again, like not just moments, but programs that are offering alternative ways forward. So for example, and this was planned before all of this even happened, but I'm a part of something that's called a healing-centered systems change program that is being run by the Collective Change Lab. And that is just started a week or two ago. And honestly, it couldn't be at a more perfect moment. I mean, it's exactly what's needed right now. And I joined this because I deeply believe in healing against trauma as a core part of systems change action in whatever system you work in, whether it's education or more broadly. But it's something that I think is really going to be not just a source of comfort, but a source of guidance for all of us who are participating in it and how we can carry that forward. And it's, again, that capacity building aspect is the framing that I bring to all of my work. I'm trying to lean into that for myself as well, and to help remind others where their capacity exists and provide those opportunities where I can, or to connect them to those opportunities in a way that I think would be useful in this moment. And we're not operating completely blindly, but sometimes it feels that way, right? And I think it's now more than ever that we lean on these tools and the people that are able to really be a guiding force of that light.
And what about students? How are they doing?
So I am not teaching right now, but from what I've heard from my colleagues, and not just at the higher ed level, at the secondary level in particular, because I've worked with youth across different age groups, and I feel that there's a mixed bag. Like, some are really speaking up and asking questions and trying to challenge what's happening in the classroom. And there's others that are just completely silent on it, or perhaps completely overwhelmed by so many of the other traumas that they're dealing with on the daily, that they're not even sure how to make sense of what's happening in the moment, or they don't have the bandwidth to do that. But I am concerned because, especially from a perspective of a faculty member, what this means for how to respond in the classroom, and like the ability to be able to do your job and to serve your students openly and freely, and also in a way that honors the integrity of your field and the integrity of the things you're trying to teach, and isn't being rewritten in real time in history, right? And I think that's going to be a major challenge. And I do really worry because, again, it's only been, a few weeks or so. And there's so much uncertainty right now in this moment of how they're going to be able to, proceed forward, and what that means for their student, the impacts that it will have on their students in the short and long term, I think is a really critical question we need to be asking right now.
Yeah, it seems like maybe professors, instructors, need to be modeling like the system regulation, the nervous system regulation, as well as the piece you mentioned about agency, because it could be like the classroom or the tutorial or whatever could be a source of co-regulation and staying centered on the work to be done and what the work is to be done given that field, etc. Yeah, I have family members who are high school teachers in Florida, so they've already been dealing with a bit of this because of Florida. But yeah, it's very worrying to think about the mental health of young people if the adults that they're looking to aren't regulated themselves.
Yeah, and I think this relates a lot to the kind of work I've been engaged in most recently around climate mental health, and exploring what the needs, and not just resource-wise, but the training that's necessary for faculty at the secondary and collegiate level, and also what supports they already have in place or have been leaning into as not just coping mechanisms, but really to enable them to really show up in this work in a big way. And I was talking earlier in the beginning about sort of how my own experience in working in the field of climate change and sustainable development has really, in some ways, prepared me for this moment because of the uncertainty, because of the catastrophe and the devastation more and more. But I've seen, in all different places, the U.S. and abroad, that had just wrecked entire lives, entire communities, and will have long-term implications for their future to thrive and survive. But I think what I'm seeing in terms of like some of the challenges just in comparing that, like what's happening in the classroom or what kind of the limitations on the resources available because of whether it's the policies within the institutional setting or the state, policies around education. That's even more so apparent with like secondary educators. But the idea of like, how do we make sure that we're equipping educators and researchers and those doing this work in community, in the fields as practitioners with the not just the preparation to be able to respond in the moment with the kind of very normal, very real emotional upheaval that can come through learning about, experiencing directly, and trying to work to address climate change and the disasters that are happening around the world. But also, how are we preparing them to be able to reflect and to process and cope with and moderate those emotions for themselves? And I think, we hear this over and over again, sort of the put your mask on first so that you can help those next to you or your child or whatever. I mean, that can't be ever more real than it in the sense of being able to do this really difficult work. And, social justice advocates, activists would say the same thing, but we have a tradition of burnout and over exploiting each other and ourselves, not because intentionally so, but because we care so much, we care so deeply, passionately about what we're doing and the causes and the students and communities we're serving, that there's just not the bandwidth. There's just not the ability at moments, or the resources aren't there. And what can we do to change that? And I think that what's happening in this moment is kind of an important, if not all the more necessary opportunity to really respond to that, because it's not just going to be hitting climate change, it's going to be hitting people working in the health fields, especially public health, all different sectors, all different disciplines. And now I think we really need to be taking this more seriously and not that things aren't already happening. There's some incredible programs and incredible resources that certain universities are doing, but I think they're more the exception than the rule. And so how can we be transforming the institutional climate and environment to be able to support in a more cohesive way, and a way that shows all those who are doing this work that their well-being matters as much, if not, as much as what we care about for their students and the work that we're doing, but also for the ability to be able to continue that work forward and to really have the impact that we're striving to have in education and beyond.
So to a certain degree, I might even say to a very large degree, you're talking about a well-being not just as a personal practice, but a well-being as something that is not only community-oriented, but also must be built and maintained and grown in community. You've also talked about well-being as something that is cross-cutting, not specific to any one domain, because any educator of any discipline or sub-discipline is dealing with other people in their realm. It could be colleagues, it could be students, in many cases, perhaps both of those groups, plus other groups as well. And of course, they have possibly their own families and friends that also affect and are affected by their own well-being. So I would be interested to hear from you from the nature of resources. And you've talked about resources quite a bit in our podcast today. What are your thoughts on well-being as a skill that must be learned and practiced the way somebody might learn and practice a new language? And I use that example intentionally because you don't have to go to a school and get a degree in language to be able to speak a new language. But sometimes structure and training and controlled environments to build and practice a skill, sometimes those types of things help. So to consider well-being is not just something that you might pick up in an article in the Harvard Business Review, for instance, or by reading one self-help book. To what degree would you recommend well-being as some type of skill that people really need to focus attention on regarding the learning and practice of it? And I even hesitate to use the word skill because sometimes the word skill speaks the word training and certificates and degrees and such. But I'm not trying to say somebody should go and take a course in well-being and get a degree or a certification. And yet I am trying to say, do we need to go beyond just reading articles or little books to build well-being, especially in times of rapid change, and especially in group settings where, of course, our internal realm affects the internal realms of the people around us?
That's a really interesting question, way to frame it, Chris. To give myself a sense of what you're talking about, I feel like there's a level of capacity instead of skill. That's probably the word that I would use in this sense, and it's the capacity to feel that you can speak about what you're experiencing, that you have that capacity, and that the support that community in which to do that, I think is a really critical aspect of this. And when I talk about that, it's not just can I voice my emotions or can I speak up when I feel that there's an injustice happening or that things aren't in alignment with what we're being charged to do here in our duties as an educator, what have you. But it's also just the capacity to feel like you can reflect and have that space to do that in a the word safe space is very much been demonized, especially in higher education. I don't necessarily agree with it, but to basically have that space to feel like you're not going to be attacked or judged or thrown under a bus or essentially that your job is going to be at risk because you're voicing a real concern. And that requires one, having an environment, a community in which you work that really is creating a culture of care, that's creating the kind of welcoming environment of diversity, equity, and inclusion that is being demonized right now. That requires feeling like your voice actually matters, that you matter personally. And you'd be astonished to see how many people who are doing such important work just feel like they don't really make a difference or that their job is treated as being insignificant, especially educators, in this time, in this particular climate we find ourselves in. And I worry the damage that that's doing, not just to the important work that they're showing up day in and day out and sacrificing to do. And I kid you not, it's in many cases a very big sacrifice to do this work in every aspect that you can imagine, including financial and economic sacrifice. But like it's a sacrifice on our souls in some ways. The very like feelings of dignity and how the field in which we're working can be demonized. That can be a direct attack on our dignity. And I think one of the things that's really critical to well-being is to feel like you're not just doing something that matters, but that you're part of a community that really recognizes that. And then not just your internal community, but also your external community. And that includes this, the students you're serving, the families of those students, the communities you're working in. And that's difficult to do because there's been such a direct, threat on trust. And I think that comes from a lot of different places and for a lot of different reasons, but trust is a very fragile thing to cultivate at this point in time. And community, I would say, in many regards, would also fall in line with that. And you can't have community without trust. And you can't have that kind of culture of care without trust. And those are things that, in my own work, in building partnerships and fostering the kind of reciprocity of the work that I do, with the communities that I collaborate with, building that sense of trust is foundational. It's throughout. It's not we do this and that's done. Let's move forward. Now we can do the actual real work. No, that's a constant thing that you have to nurture. And it's not easy, and it takes a lot of time. And often we don't have the patience or the freedom to be able to do that because we're constrained by so many other things and obligations and protocols that we have to follow that distract us from that really meaningful aspect of the work. I'm starting to get a little off topic here, but I think.
Oh no, I think trust is super important, and you also spoke about burnout, and yesterday I was on the bus to a pharmacist, like an hour away. And so I was listening to one of my favorite podcasts, and it's called Seriously Wrong. And the episode is called Afternoon in Utopia. And last week they did Morning in Utopia. So it's like imagining what a utopian world to them would look like in the morning. And then yesterday it was about the afternoon. And there was this thing that they said that the only authoritarianism that there would be in this utopia would be that if people overwork, that these people would come in an ambulance or a police car or whatever. And they would have been told someone has been fixing bicycles from 6 a.m. to midnight, 5 days in a row. They're not taking a break. Okay, we're on our way. And they rush off to this place, and they're knocking on the door. Open up. Someone in there's been working too much. And the guy's in there, and he opens the door with the wrench or whatever. And they're stop fixing that bike. Other people can fix the bikes. You have to be able to do this. You need to take some time off. And then they're argue. If you argue with us, you're going to have to take 2 weeks off. If you're still arguing with us, 3 weeks. No, you're still arguing. Okay, we're taking you to the airport. You're on your way to Mexico to a beach. Do not, you cannot work for a month. And then they went on to make it funnier, because then it was well, who's going to police those people that are having too much fun, going around? And they called them, I think, authoritarian leisure time goons or something. And then they had to come up with then there's authoritarian leisure time, whatever. And so then they were I'm having so much fun finding the people who are overworking, and I just want to do a couple more hours. No, you have to stop, and you have to. But there's that sense of caring about each other in that way, to really recognize that people are overworking, to have that sense of, and it's quite countercultural to say to each other, you're overworking, because we tend to admire, oh, Margaret Thatcher only slept 4 hours a night or whatever. Isn't that great? So I just wanted to to share that because it's great to, to play with that idea and how can we have that trust and care and community where we stop each other, with love from overworking.
Well,
Yeah, how can we have the value of well-being
yeah.
as I perhaps lack the vocabulary, but I might say this virtue almost. Perhaps virtue is a loaded word, but the idea of well-being as something to aspire to and not self-care as a way of saying that you care about yourself more than you care about anybody else. And of course, there are nuances there, and there's a balance. I hesitate to use the word balance. It's not my favorite word, but I think in this context, to bring in the notion that caring for ourselves, not just as individuals, but ourselves as groups, as communities, is a prerequisite to caring for others and caring for communities beyond our communities, to elevate and practice elevating that as a value is something I'm going away from this conversation with. Because I too, and perhaps this goes back to my younger days, idealizing people we might call tech bros now, but the idea of the 80-hour weeks and the sleeping in the office. And I'm realizing more and more that this value of overwork as a way of showing that you actually care is certainly not limited to the tech industry. It's very much broader and crosses many, many domains. So I'm rambling a little bit, but I will just say what I'm leaving with after this podcast is the idea that I too can model well-being as something that is worthy of elevation and worthy of aspiring to. And of course, we're talking about well-being not just as individuals, but also as communities.
I love that, Chris. And there's actually a movement happening around exactly that called the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. The work that they're doing is really to shift the framing around what economic purpose is for and really ground it in well-being and well-being of people and planet, or people with planet in harmony in that sense. And I think it's such an important thing. It seems so trivial, but that's just that individual shift in framing to really encompass that, embody that, internalize that, integrate it into our work. I mean, it can have profound impacts in such a huge way. And I mean, my own dissertation degree focus was on really shifting that framing from development to well-being as a framework, and how that really shows up in the ways in which the different types of approaches that we do this work can unfold, and how that can really serve as more of a capacity building model than a do for model or a solutions model alone, where there's one and done kind of thing and we can move on. Rather, it's this ongoing nurturing process, and it's a daily practice. It's a daily piece of our work, but it's also can't be done in isolation. It has to be done in community to really have the effect that we're aspiring to have. Because if you're doing really well in that self-care, quote unquote, space, but your community is burning outside, you're not going to get very far, right? So how do we really bring this into that broader perspective and really embrace that wholly in all aspects of well-being in our lives, in our work?
So, Julianna, I would like to invite you, as we close out the podcast today, to share anything that you might want our listeners to leave with. We've talked across a number of domains, actually, in a way under the banner of higher education, but more broadly under the banner of well-being and how well-being crosses many domains, is not specific to any type of academic discipline, but is really about us as people in the individual sense and in the community sense. So with that context having been set by today's podcast, just like to ask if there's something that you'd like people to leave with.
Thanks for that, Chris. Yeah, there's a couple things I want to just quickly remind us all of. I need this reminder as much as anybody, but that the kind of emotions that we're feeling and sensing right now are normal, and you don't need to be pushing them aside or throwing them away, although you may need to be taking a break from certain things, and that's okay too. And it's not that you're not doing your part or you're not caring enough, but if you're crippled or completely incapacitated, that's not helpful to anybody, nor is it helpful to yourself, right? So just be kind and compassionate toward yourself as much as you are, and hopefully that you are being compassionate to others and really showing that care and community, but also don't forget and neglect that in yourself. And I will say that, going back to the message I was saying earlier about fear as being such a prominent thing that not just I'm experiencing, but I'm seeing, witnessing all around, and sort of what is a driving force right now for many that are stowing that fear, intentionally so, is that while it's normal, it can also take hold and take over. And so how do we not deny that fear, but actually recognize it, acknowledge it, disempower the fear, so that we can use that as a motivator to continue to act, to be responsive, to be vigilant. And a dear friend of mine, we were talking about what can we be doing? What have I been doing to reach out to others and to foster that sense of community? A dear friend of mine and former colleague actually sent me a postcard with the quote from Nina Simone that says, "I'll tell you what freedom is to me, no fear." And this came up on one of my social media feeds today in honor of Black History Month. And I thought it was just fitting for our conversation today, and to shout out to my friend Karen, who was very wonderful to be thoughtful and remind me that we're going to get through this together, and that it's not a solo fight. So to be willing to recognize that lean on each other, and community is our power, is our purpose. So
Yeah, brilliant. That's right along the theme of our messaging. So thank you very much for being willing to come on the podcast.
thank
Yes,
you.
thank you very much. Thank you, Juliana. And a big thanks also to our listeners who have tuned in for our final episode of the We Are Lach podcast. We have produced a new podcast, Heather and I, under the name of Morning Tinto. So be sure to subscribe to that. You can find more information in the show notes, as well as information about some of the references that were mentioned in today's recording. Until then, we will talk to you next time. Bye-bye.